Hi, I'm Jacob Kenney.
And I'm Liam McPherson.
It's the newest edition of your uncle's favorite podcast.
It's Speech from the Throne! We're here to bring you the latest and greatest from the halls of power.
But not with more carbon capture fantasies. We're just here to argue.
Hey Jacob, what are we talking about today?
Well, Liam, this week, rather than talking about something that happened, I'd like to talk about something that was planned to happen. And that was, on the 9th of April, was supposed to be the in-person leadership review of one Jason Kenney, taking place in Red Deer. Now, 20,000 people signed up for that event, making it pretty obvious to my province's commander-in-chief, or soon former-to-be commander-in-chief, that he was going to be turfed. So, of course, we have a last-minute rule change, and now all UCP members will be mailing in their ballots, making it very easy for Kenney, who, again, is already under RCMP investigation, to fudge the numbers just a little bit. Now, you might ask, why would this man fudge the numbers? Well, you see, it's surprising me as well, because some audio has leaked from his office that makes it seem like he doesn't really want the job that much. Like he said to his own staffers in the privacy of his office that he doesn't really care about being Premier of Alberta, that he can lead a very more satisfying and lucrative lifestyle in the private sector. But, and this has sort of been his key message of late, someone needs to stop the lunatics running the asylum. So, I don't actually disagree with Jason Kenney too much on this point, because lunatics running the asylum has a very long history in my home province of Alberta, and I'd like to go through with this, or I'd like to show what this history is like to the audience for those who didn't have the privilege or burden of growing up in rural Alberta like I did, so we can see what exactly Jason Kenney means and what the threat is when we're talking about these right-wing fringes eating up the United Conservative Party. Alberta had 4 distinct political dynasties before the NDP took over in 2015. And the first one, to everyone's surprise, was a Liberal dynasty. And that's mostly because there was not a hugely literate political culture in 1905 when our province joined Confederation. It was really just a bunch of Laurentian elites that Laurier implanted in Alberta to run mostly without any sort of public scrutiny. But in the 1920s, throughout not just Alberta, but throughout all of Canada, there was a huge populist wave that brought all these newly settled farmers, immigrants from Eastern Europe, a lot of them together to form a new United Farmers Parties. And these were, they had the most crazy of all possible populist ideas. It really is difficult to frame them on a left-right spectrum, but they really had everything from pure Bolshevism to eugenics to openly fascist members, all in the same party, with some crazy economic theories. And they stay in power for a little bit, and then about 20 years later, we get to the social credit, which is an even crazier economic theory. And William Aberhart, who takes over in 1935, a preacher who doesn't stop being a preacher when he becomes the Premier of Alberta. For 8 years, he's Premier, and every week he has a radio program where he basically reads from his Bible and tells the people of Alberta how the government of Alberta is governing based off of scriptural law, and sort of tries to blur the distinction between church and state. And so this, if you're talking about lunatics running the asylum, we have a good 30-year period from the 1920s up until the 1943, where the lunatics absolutely are in charge. And we have the most crazy, most aggressive social conservative policies, all run by, again, mostly rural people that are in charge of the government. But then, when Ernest Manning takes over, in 1947, I think, oil is discovered in Leduc. And there's more business-friendly elements that are coming into the province. And they're not liking what they're hearing from these very socially conservative farmers. This is a time when especially hardcore evangelical Christians hadn't really made the move to being as pro-business as they are now. And so, guys like Aberhart, when they're preaching about their Christian values, they're sort of preaching in an anti-business way. They're talking about redistribution of wealth, and of course,
socialism.
Exactly, it's Christian socialism in effect. And the pro-business lobby doesn't like this. So Ernest Manning, he's in power for 25 years. You can think of him as the Stephen Harper of his day. He rules with a completely iron fist. And he turns Alberta into essentially a one-party state, and he makes it very clear to the lunatics in the asylum, you know what? I'm socially conservative. I'll do most of what you say, but dear God, stop talking about it. You guys, you sit in the back of my caucus, stay silent, and we'll have some policies, but we'll keep them on the low radar. We just want to have no public debate about this so that there can be a stable pro-business environment. And that works, as I said, for 25 years. But once he leaves, again, the party can't help itself. The farmers fight back. They have to bring back all their crazy ideas again. And this is exactly the same time that oil is now being produced in Fort McMurray, and that's a way, way bigger deal. And now we're getting way, way, way more investments in the province. And this business community, they double down and they invest everything in the progressive conservatives. And that is a bet that really pays off.
For 40-some years, 44.
For 44 years, we have the largest, the longest reigning political dynasty, not just in Alberta, but in any province, I believe. Now, this is where Alberta's economic activity totally explodes. And whereas in the previous, let's say, 40 years, maybe even 50 years, the farmers have been in charge, with business slowly coming to the forefront. Now in the PCs, we have business who's running the show, and we have our socially conservative farmers. They have a place in the party, but it's a very small place. And you have guys like Ralph Klein. He's willing to play footsie with them. He's, when same-sex marriage is legalized, he makes a big stink about that. He suggests that he's going to use a notwithstanding clause to illegalize same-sex marriage in Alberta again, but doesn't do it. It's very good. He opposes the Kyoto Protocol. He makes his little stinks for the social conservatives, but when you get down to it, pro-business all the way, and that's really the only ideology of this party. But as we get this huge business investment, Alberta's cities keep growing and growing and growing, to the point where, these farmers, not only does the government not pay as much attention to them, but they don't really need them to govern. And the PC party starts to move a little more left. Under Ed Stelmach in 2008, he wins parts of Edmonton, which used to be called Redmonton when I was growing up there, because it was so liberal. He wins a lot of that city. And so he doesn't lose the rural caucus, but he doesn't need them to govern either. He has Edmonton and Calgary solidly in his pocket, and that's all he needs. Alison Redford, same thing. In 2012, she wins a majority. And this time now she's actually losing the rural caucus to the Wild Rose Party, to a more far-right opposition. In 2015, this evolution reaches its natural ascent with Rachel Notley, who wins huge majorities in Calgary and in Edmonton, but essentially has no seats outside of the major cities of Alberta. The rural parts of Alberta, socially conservative parts of Alberta, completely go against her, but she's able to govern regardless. So when you're talking about lunatics running the asylum, essentially what we have is a 100-year history of farmers, socially conservative farmers in Alberta, starting with running the show, having complete control over the way that policy was set in Alberta, and then slowly losing their power and influence over a very long stretch of time, and just getting more and more and more and more embittered. Now Jason Kenney comes along, and he feeds into this resentment and says, there's a place for you in my party. But the problem is, when push comes to shove, there isn't a place for them in his party, because he still needs to govern, and the Alberta demographics have changed so much that the social conservatives, you can piss them off as much as you like. It's the cities you still need to govern. So in COVID, for example, he's got to do what the cities want. It takes him forever to get there. It's really uncomfortable doing it, but he knows he has no choice. He cannot give in to this social conservative faction, because they've become a fringe and what they believed was their own province. And this is sort of what worries me, Liam, is that over 100 years, this rural, socially conservative faction has lost its ability to influence provincial political discussion. But it hasn't really changed or moderated its policies at all. In fact, in some areas, it's gotten even more aggressively social conservative. And these aren't guys who just get angry and they go to a freedom convoy protest every now and then, which they did. These are also guys who have guns. We saw in the Coots border crossing, they have guns. I talked to some of my family members about that, and they're like, "We're not surprised that there are guns at the Coots border. That's every redneck has guns." Which did not
sit well.
Yeah, exactly. It did not allay my concerns at all. So these guys are seeing that their ability to affect the democratic process is waning, at the same time that their armaments are growing. And we see as well a renewed interest in Western separatism. Both on the federal level, you have like the Maverick Party, like Tamara Lich, who organized the convoys, the Freedom Convoy, had a national recognition. She was at the Maverick Party before, a separatist federal party. You have the Western Independence Party, that's the right-wing alternative to the UCP in Alberta. They've gotten as high as 20% in the polls, sitting about 10% now, but as high as 20%. It's a real issue. It's a really big issue. And unlike, as I said, Quebec sovereigntists, for example, who we had the FLQ, is definitely very violent. This is a group of people that are armed to a much higher extent. We cannot allow, and you alluded to this in, I think, episode 3, where you said, I have negative thoughts about the Bloc Québécois. I do have negative thoughts about the Bloc Québécois. I think they should be banned. I don't think that separatist parties should be allowed to run in a federal or provincial election. I think the most basic tenet of loyalty, because you have to. Well, the thing, when you are the opposition, you say you're the loyal opposition. You're not the opposition that's trying to break apart or destroy the country. You're loyal to the country. So I think if you're going to run in our parliamentary system, you got to pledge loyalty to the country.
A very colonialist of you, Jacob.
It's not colonialist. It is trying to keep a fracturing country from falling apart any farther. We need to set a very strong message to anyone that's trying to take apart a country that no, Canada's here, Canada's going to stay here, and we want to keep our country a strong, united force against these sorts of fascistic elements that are trying to tear it apart.
Well, that was a compelling argument. And lots of what you said, like particularly the history, was great context, because I don't think a lot of people, myself included, know the whole history politically of what happened in that province. They think of it, I think the average Canadian might think of it as maybe it feels a little bit wrong from time to time, but people don't quite understand why. So that helps. I hope that helps give people some context. And I think where you lost me there was, I mean, I made that joke about colonialists, not to say that you're like full colonialist, but it's just, I don't know, it's like, obviously I'm not a separatist and I don't like the Bloc either, and I would never vote for the Bloc, and they cause a lot of pain. There was a time where maybe they were viewed as necessary or were necessary in some fashion. I don't, or maybe there wasn't a time where they were particularly, but I think the height of their fame was the 90s for sure. I agree that they're some 30 years out of date and a little bit of a dinosaur, and they've done this bizarre shift from being sort of a workers' party that was a little bit more socially liberal to going almost like flirting with far right kind of social ideas, and working with the conservatives more than their old partners, the NDP. It's been interesting to see that sort of shift sort of along the spectrum, one direction of the spectrum. But I don't know, there's something about the principle of, like, when you said swearing allegiance to the country, like, of course you have to, like, want to serve the country, but maybe there should be a tightening of parliamentary procedure then. Like, maybe it's that simple where they just go, okay, like, if you advocate for causes such as X, Y, Z, like, and it could, if there's a fringe party that pops up down the line as well, like, it could prevent maybe future fringe parties from existing, like maybe far right fringe parties. Like, if your party is like in violation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or advocates for, or like, maybe there's certain things like that should be cracked down on via parliamentary procedure. But I don't know if outright banning a certain ideology from like, not that you're suggesting that banning them from organizing in any way, but like, I feel like banning the MPs from the House, particularly for, like, specifically for the Bloc, would cause more harm to national unity than it would add to the national unity. But I think that, and I know I can hear you sighing, and I know it's like, that's the problem when you have to keep together this cobbled federation. That's why national unity is hard, because Alberta has its own interests, and they don't always feel that they're being addressed, and Quebec has its own interests, and like, sometimes their interests, like, for example, like Bill 21, obviously in full violation of the Charter. The notwithstanding clause was used to keep it in place. That is, if you don't know, listeners, a clause in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the notwithstanding clause, that allows premiers or prime ministers even to override charter freedoms, so charter rights and freedoms. And so that's quite disturbing. And it was rarely used. It was used, I believe, in the late 80s by the Quebec Premier Bourassa, Robert Bourassa, who used it to pass Bill 101. It wasn't Bill 101. It was, I can't remember the name of the bill, but it was another language bill in the late 80s. And then nobody really touched it. And even Stephen Harper, when gay marriage was passed, he said, I'm not going to use, or same-sex marriage, I should say, he's like, I'm not going to use the notwithstanding clause to override it, and he didn't. And then Francois Legault uses it out of the blue, and Quebec has used it as a tool, I suppose, the most historically, so that's where they stand out. But I don't think pulling the Bloc from, the House of Commons is necessarily the best way to do that. I think that would only inflame separatist tensions, to be honest. I mean, maybe long-term, who knows, but certainly short-term, that would not help national unity. Alberta, as you said, and you're correct, is about to teeter over the edge. It's teetering over on the precipice of something disastrous. We saw at Coots. If you didn't hear, like, there were weapons. There was a weapons cache found at Coots, Alberta, the blockade, which was part of the Freedom Convoy, and dozens of weapons seized. And it's scary. And Jacob asked his uncle about it. Like, you told me that you asked your uncle about it, and your uncle said, like, that's what any redneck would have, and I was just shocked by that. Like, I can't believe that.
Or you have like Colton Boosie when he got shot stumbling onto a farm in Saskatchewan, or
Colton
I
Boosie,
know or I know just a farm a few minutes down the road from me where I grew up. There was a guy that got robbed, and he went out with a rifle and shot at the guys that were robbing him as well. Like, it's just a common household item to have a gun to defend your farm. And there's hunting rifles and I guess more legitimate reasons to have weapons, but it's what's undoubtable is that it is a region of the country where gun ownership is incredibly high for a nation that sort of prides itself on being disarmed. And it just sort of makes the problem worse. So they have a really concentrated ownership in a particular area that really does not share the same values as the rest of the country at all.
Yeah.
Sorry, do you have more to say?
And I'm sorry, I was just pondering what you said, and I mean, yeah, like I think that the Federation is becoming tenuous again for the first time. Well, I mean, throughout our history, it's been tenuous, but this is one of the most tense moments I think there's been in quite a long time, in terms of tensions amongst different regions of the country, and like it's going to be a tricky next 20 years or 30 years as we transition away from oil. I think it's going to be interesting to see how that, I'm hoping to God the right supports for workers will be in place, because if it wreaks mass financial havoc, that's just going to, or economic havoc, that's going to just feed everything in a negative way. I hope by then maybe there's some sort of basic income in place or some sort of temporary measure while they're transitioning. I know there's a plan to transition some of them to green jobs, and I hope to God that goes smoothly, because they're teetering on the precipice. Separatist sentiment there has been as high as it ever has been, and it's rising in the other prairie provinces. It's easy to single out the Bloc, but for being the Bloc, because they're the Bloc, like they irritate me. Yeah. Like I'm by no means a fan of the Bloc Québécois, but there are other parts of this federation that have tensions as well, and I feel like but I feel like it's a slippery slope to suggest that, okay, well, if these places are teetering on the precipice, let's take away any, and then by this I don't mean guns, listeners, but let's take away any like political sort of recourse that they have and crush them out of existence. And I think that that's like a short-term high, it's like that'll work for a few years or maybe a decade, and then eventually it'll start to simmer. Like it's like anybody, when they wipe out their political opponents, there's sort of a honeymoon period, and it lasts for a while, and then all of a sudden it starts rising again. There's a long period of time where you can suppress, but it's hard. I don't ever see that being a solution to a long-term stability. I don't think the solution is endless concessions either for either of those places, Quebec or Alberta. That being said, you got to strike a balance, and it's easy to sit there and like criticize, but I think like that it has to be some of the most challenging geopolitical chess within our own country, like the most challenging Confederation chess game to try to please everybody, and the reality is you're never going to please everybody. And I don't think you should try to please everybody. That's why I don't think concessions are a solution, but I don't know if the solution is to sort of remove their political sort of way of making a statement, but unless it's something super fringe, like if it's like this party wants to murder a certain race, like they just want to exterminate a race, or like something horrific, like no, you shouldn't be allowed to have a platform. Like that's different. And arguably some of the territory that the Conservatives and the Bloc have been getting into it's reaching that territory, and there's a line, and it will reach that. Where's the line? It'll reach a line, but I don't think that it would go well for national unity, even if that was the morally correct option.
Or if you think like both the Liberals and Conservatives had platforms of increasing residential schools in the past, so it's certainly not wanting to exterminate the race is something that has been in the political mainstream before, which is
horrifying to think of.
I know, and that's what I'm trying to say is like if it's not tamped down, it can come back. So
sure,
like,
and I'd certainly be for preventing any party that wants to do that from ever getting a seat anywhere.
and so like in the 1930s, before World War II, there was a very strong fascist movement in North America. Fascists were elected to Parliament in Alberta. I think it was in Lethbridge or in Leduc. An openly fascist candidate was elected to Parliament, and regular polling of North America would find that there was a significant portion of the population that was willing to call themselves fascists, and they thought that Hitler was a great guy. And you had people like Ford, who was very willing to talk about his anti-Semitism and ties
right.
to Hitler. And then in World War II, it snaps and the public swings massively against the fascists, and we wouldn't even think that was a discussion. But at the time, in the 1930s, people were having exactly the same sort of discussions about whether we do or do not allow fascist discourse into our democratic discussion, like you and I are having now. Now, of course, it was much more openly violent. It was much more openly racist. So it was just easier for people to say that they would be against it. But even then, they weren't willing to take the step of actually removing names off the ballots or stopping parties from representing themselves. And that was a massive mistake.
Sure, but again, what I'd say to that is, I hope you're not comparing the Bloc Québécois, who yes are the Bloc and they're annoying, but I hope you're not comparing them to Nazi fascists.
No. What I'm trying to say is, when there is a common enemy, the Overton window can shift overnight. And so what once looked like there was a huge polarized divide in North America suddenly became all the country, every country in North America. Well, I should just say the United States and Canada. They had a polarized national environment suddenly comes together with huge, astounding political majorities to defeat the Nazis. And now is actually a great time to be using a common enemy to throw out the far-right elements in our society. And that's Vladimir Putin. We've been seeing these convoy protesters have been sharing Kremlin propaganda. We have been seeing that separatist elements in Ukraine were sort of the casus belli for the Russians to invade Ukraine in the first place. If we can make an argument of how separatists in this country are a threat to our country and tie them in with Ukraine, if we can see separatists tie them in with Putin, if we can see separatists who are sharing Kremlin propaganda, we can use this huge groundswell of support in favor of Ukraine, this huge groundswell of support against Putin to push out, to terrify the far right from the conversation. This is one of the few avenues we'll ever have where public support is so uniformly in one direction. But it's just not really that conversation isn't being had, and it will take some political wizardry, but it's not impossible. And that's why I think it's our leaders just aren't willing to use the political capital that they have. They need to be a little more creative with the situation that they're being given. Never waste a crisis. This is a crisis. You can absolutely you have some elements that are very dangerous that need to be taken care of. We have the strength now to beat them, so let's start a fight and get rid of them rather than waiting for them to grow their strength and potentially beat us in the future.
Well, I have to, I just, before I respond to that formally, when you said you don't want to waste a good crisis, my mind just flicked back to this Paul Wells article in Maclean's. And or maybe it wasn't, I don't know if Paul Wells wrote it but I know he certainly referenced it. Where it was the Prime Minister understands the importance of this moment. When the pandemic started, there were all these unnamed Liberal staffers boasting he's going to do something big. He understands the importance of it. And then nothing happened until he was offered with stability from the NDP. Then something happened and could happen. And I'll give him that. But it's just funny. It's he didn't want to waste a good crisis, and honestly, it should have been the moment where he sees the opportunity, but we're still
he chose not to.
Yeah, sure, childcare is going to happen. That's going to be great. There's a chance that dental care and some level of pharmacare will happen. That's fine. Those are if all three of those things happen, that would be remarkable. I'm skeptical because, as we talked about last episode, I'm skeptical that the two of them will be able to work together effectively, though I hope that they can. But the only surety right now is childcare. The rest of his legacy has been dragging his heels so far, and the healthcare system is in dire need of help. Pharmacare could be a piece of that, but it's got to be an overhaul. Our system is, what's the word I'm looking for? It's hemorrhaging. It is hemorrhaging staff. It is rapidly increasing wait times. It is sluggish. It is bureaucratic sometimes, I think. And it's a shame that, given the fact that we're a G7 country, that we can't pull up our bootstraps and provide people with G7 quality healthcare. It's mind-blowing to me. And someone would go, well, the States is a G7 country, and like maybe we should just privatize more. No, like put money into a proper universal healthcare system. Other countries have done it. They've put the proper funding toward it. There certainly are some mixed public-private systems as well, but there are full-fledged public systems that work efficiently, that are structured somewhat differently from ours, and I think we could learn from those instead of trying to put Band-Aids on this terribly inefficient and, I would argue, deadly system in some cases. Now, when it comes to national unity, when it comes to bringing the country together, I'm not going to defend Trudeau all the time. I think he's been polarizing. A lot of it's not his fault because it's his last name, but he also chose to run and did very well in large part because of his last name. He had a good team behind him electorally, but the Liberal leadership race in 2012-13 was a coronation because the Trudeau era was deemed to be back. And his name means something. So, sure, he gets a little bit of unjust polarization, but he's been getting some valid criticism for many years now, and I don't think he can quite read the room for when it's time to go. I fear that he won't go when he needs to. I could be proven wrong, but okay, maybe he's not the guy to bring the country together. There's been over 20 premiers now, 23 prime ministers rather now, that have tried to keep the country together. They've so far succeeded, sometimes just barely, aka 1995, 1980 was pretty tense, and right now it's getting pretty tense. And don't know if the solution is kind of lumping separatist parties in with fascist kind of, like, there's some overlap, so that's where it gets tricky, right? Like a lot of the Maverick Party types, you're correct, like Tamara Lich, the People's Party types, they have a lot of guns and they're pretty fascist. Like, it's very clear that they're, so, like, I think it's tricky because if Alberta separatists only advocated for Alberta separatism like maybe the Bloc historically have, which is it's never been violent, that would be one thing. If now it's getting into the FLQ, like we could be years away from an FLQ type situation. Like it's getting worse because, like I said, we found weapons at Coutts, and we do have to be prepared to tackle that. But I think like that isn't done through parliamentary procedure or it's done in part through legislation, but it's not done through parliamentary procedure. It's done through, like I said, legislation, and it's done through de-radicalization approaches, which, it's not going to do it on its own, but like de-radicalization, regulating big tech, regulating the kind of content they allow. If you want to operate in Canada, here's what you do. If you don't like it, too bad. They get so many breaks, these guys. And like you were saying a little bit in the last episode, you go on a computer, you get Jordan Peterson, you get Ben Shapiro. Yeah. It's like, if you're a young male, particularly young and white, but not exclusively, like young men, as a general rule, are being spoon-fed this nonsense. In large part, probably in Alberta, maybe they're fed up, maybe their dad worked in the oil fields and lost his job or something. And it's really hurt the family, and they really didn't like Trudeau to begin with, and now they really don't like Trudeau, and they have guns, and then maybe the guy gets on. I mean, I'm just kind of, I don't know if there's anybody that fits this case, but they start going further down the rabbit hole. I know people are going down the rabbit hole. Those people exist because they were at the convoy. I just mean I'm not referencing a specific case. This is the hypothetical thing that is, I think, really happening on the ground. You've got people going down the rabbit hole online. And instead of the web there being some sort of intervening mechanism, like, hey, or, like, other than click here to find COVID-19 information. Like, it's not like, hey, are you okay? Like, there's nobody intervening kind of to stop these people from getting into these rabbit holes, onto these tangents. And they're digging and digging and digging, and then all of a sudden they get some guns, and, like, who knows, It's just, we saw it with ISIS. There were a number of thousands, I believe, of Westerners from various countries that went to fight for ISIS, and that's because they were radicalized online, and that was, of course, on a much smaller scale. But this has the potential to be so big in 5 or 10 years that it could be an FLQ-like situation. It could be worse. So I think with that kind of stuff, we absolutely need to tamp down on that. I don't know if the solution is to do what you're saying, but like, my God, we need CSIS on this, watching everything. We need proper regulation. We need proper taxes on these guys. We need, and guess what? If they say, fine, we'll leave, we don't want to do that,
that's okay.
Then that's okay. Because it really isn't. We all use social media because it's addictive. We don't use it because we always like to be on there. It's addictive, right? So anyway, that's my TED Talk. So what do you think of that, Jacob?
Well,
what did you think of that ContraPoint? Shout out to Natalie Wynn.
I completely agree with you that big tech is part of the problem, not the solution in this case. And if they want to leave because they think that regulation is unacceptable, that's probably perfectly fine. And we've seen examples like in the European Union where they have been announcing more regulation. Facebook threatened to leave, and the EU said, that's totally cool with us, kids. You can head on out. I think that a Canadian government that had some guts would be willing to take a similar stance. But as I try to present in the history lesson, these sorts of sentiments have existed for a long time in Alberta. They're not a creation of the social media environment. They've
but
really
it makes
been
it
exacerbated by it. Exactly.
Yeah.
They've been strongly exacerbated by it. And, our greatest strength as a country, I think, is our multicultural, our ability to allow multiple cultures, multiple peoples to exist in the same space. And that's worked really well in our cities, but it has slowed down, or it's probably regressing even in the countryside. And that's really sad because in the prairies where I grew up, a century ago, this was the melting pot. It used to be the melting pot where you had people from all different areas in Europe, people that didn't really speak English or any sort of common language come together and build their own communities. And now these communities are becoming more and more insular and afraid of outsiders. I think we need to take a very, very strong stand against them. Because
so a culture war.
It was, in a sense, because like multiculturalism in a world with global warming, where there's going to be a whole bunch of refugees, we know they're coming. We know that there's a country like Bangladesh is going to be underwater in a few years. That's 140 million people. Where are they going to go? We know there are going to be loads and loads of people who are going to be stateless. And Canada is one of the few countries in the world that has a multicultural history where we can integrate all these people effectively into our nation. Like every country in Europe, usually the children of immigrants score worse on their national test scores than the children or than the native-born children. In Canada, children of immigrants have exactly the same or just slightly lower test scores than those who are born here. We are, and this is something no one talks about, but it's a superpower of Canada. It is an incredible institutional ability of ours. And I think it's a sort of bureaucratic technology we have that could really push our country into a tier we've never been in before. We could be a truly great country if we lean into this. But there are areas of this country, Quebec, in particular, and rural Alberta in particular, where this faith and multiculturalism is fraying, where the desire for multiculturalism is reversing.
Particularly in the rural areas.
Absolutely. Yeah, like
not
Montreal
so much in the cities.
Montreal is a province in and of itself.
Quebec City is very conservative, though. They have very conservative talk radio shock jocks. But sorry.
No. So, and these are, if we are taking the far right in America seriously, these are huge areas of vulnerability for us. But if we're able to convert these areas, if we're able to make, like the rural Alberta, rural Saskatchewan, Quebec multicultural, then these are also the places where we can bring new people in, where we can, and we have like really, really expensive real estate elsewhere in the cities. We need to move our people somewhere. But, if I'm an immigrant, especially if I'm a black or brown immigrant, I'm not moving to rural Alberta because I'm scared I'm going to be beaten, right? I'm not going to go there. I don't want to be spat on by people when I go there. But if we can convert those areas, if we make them multicultural, this is a huge window of opportunity. So why are we, this is what I'm going to ask, why are we allowing these areas of our country to still be against multiculturalism? We need to make a very clear stance that this is what our country is, this is what our values are, and if you're against it, you don't want to be part of our country, and you are not allowed to speak anymore. Like we just need to be willing to, and it doesn't have to be legislated. Of course, it can't be legislated. We just need to take a stronger stance in politics. And I think that's why banning separatist parties is sort of the first way, because it removes automatically this outlet for that discussion to be having. Like, and the example I'll give is in Alberta when I was growing up, it was a one-party state, essentially. It was, you could, if you wanted to do anything, it was through the PCs. So in 2015, I was a politically active person. I was certainly very left-wing as a high schooler, but I didn't really see any left-wing opportunity. I was very afraid of the far right in the Wild Rose, so I chose to work with the PCs. It's as simple as that. If there is only a few avenues open to you, you'll choose the one that mostly conforms to your views, but you won't go necessarily for what you would have done if there was a different alternative. And it can be the same with these separatists. Like, we just assume because there are a bunch of people voting for the BQ that if let's say 30 or 40% of Quebecers are voting for BQ, that if we cut out the BQ, that means 30 or 40% of Quebecers would be furious. I don't think so. I think it would be the few thousand party members would be furious, but everyone else would be like, okay, whatever, I'll vote for whatever middling pro-Quebec sort of party is here, just not one that advocates for the breakup of our country. I'm not suggesting we disenfranchise a whole bunch of people. I'm suggesting we make it more difficult to express opinions of that separatist nature in the mainstream political discourse. That's what I'm suggesting, and I think the public will mostly go along with it. It's just right now we're sort of locked in this echo chamber, and the only way to stop an echo chamber is to silence the voice. And once that's done, new voices can fill in that avenue, and people can be converted. But unless we tackle the problem at its root, and go after the people who are organizing and proliferating this sort of hateful anti-multicultural separatist language, we're never going to fix the problem. We have to treat the enemy as an enemy.
Well, I think I agree with the substance, or not the substance, rather the merit of what you're saying. I think I'd go about it differently than you.
Well, that's what I want to know, Liam, because you say, "Oh, it's not policy that's the answer. It's not legislation that's the answer." But what is your answer?
Well, I didn't say it's not policy. I said it's not legislation that a bunch of the 338 MPs can pass. Mm-hmm. I think it's certainly more competent policy that could make a huge difference. We don't have a competent policy on this stuff. We really don't. We've been losing the plot on this for years now. We have to get our butt in gear in terms of surveillance. I think online surveillance to some level is necessary for people getting into this stuff. And intervention where required, and I don't know, I can't pretend to be a national security expert, so I'm not going to give you hyper-specific policy measures, but, some sort of intervention could be required. What could that look like? Would it be RCMP? Would it be CSIS? Would it be a mental health person that could come in? Because usually not always, but usually there's something that's making their lives miserable, these people, who, specifically when they turn to fascist conspiracy theory ridden rhetoric. So, what does that look like? Well, you look at the root of it. What's the root of it? You gave an outline of the history earlier on in the episode. Okay, how do you tackle the root of it? So I think what you can do for a lot of these people is to, particularly if they're struggling economically and they're not doing as well as they once were and they're feeling isolated, do things that will keep them less isolated. Things that are less impactful on a national level, but like impactful at the local level. An example would be something as simple as rural internet. That's not going to, again, be impactful on the national level, but it's a start. Ways to connect these people to their communities. At the larger level, to actually make a difference, you have to provide the proper economic supports. I've always said that if something like basic income existed in the U.S. in the Obama era, you would see a lot less economic discontent in the Rust Belt, for one.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I think that is a huge, and okay, so maybe some legislation would go along with that, but I guess what I mean is I don't think, when I was arguing against your point, I said I don't think legislation is the answer. I meant legislation specifically to coerce people out of, or to ban them from being separatists. And that's what I have a problem with. More just on the principle of it, I dislike. So that's why I would rather address it through economic supports, through rural supports, connecting people to their communities, making sure they have adequate services. The rural areas do get ignored, and that's part of why they're feeling alienated.
Yeah.
So give them the proper attention. Yeah, you're not going to win a seat, but at some point there becomes a moral argument to give them the proper attention on those levels. That can go a long way. A just, fair transition from the oil industry to the green tech industry can go a long way. There are tools in our toolbox that we have right now that there could be maybe it would take 10, 15 years to fully work out, but we could solve this. And I don't think it's possible to solve it sitting down with an Alberta premier. And the reason I say that isn't because Alberta's opinions don't matter. It's because as Jacob was saying, the attitude in Alberta right now is so hyper partisan. Which brings me to just touch on Jason Kenney specifically. Jason Kenney, for a long time, was said to be this strategic wizard, and there was some proof of that in 2011, in particular, when he did a good job doing outreach in immigrant communities. And that was a big part of Harper's majority, and he was able to connect a lot of immigrants with their more socially conservative values. Not all immigrants are socially conservative, but he met with communities that he knew would skew more socially conservative in their views, and capitalized on that. And so everybody thought, okay, the Harper government's up. He's coming home to Alberta. He's coming home for his coronation. He's united the right. He's defeated his foe, Brian Jean. And is it Brian Jean or Brian Jean? Brian Jean. He's defeated his foe, Brian Jean. It's the big homecoming. He vanquishes the Orange Devil, and then it's very quickly exposed that, aside from his sort of success, maybe the second minority government that the Harper government had, and into the majority term, this supposed strategic wizard is just evaporated. We don't know where he's gone, because there's been fumble after fumble after fumble after fumble, and not all of that is his fault. A lot of it is. What's not is the changing demographics, increased polarization. You've got the Wild Rose, which was once vanquished, coming back in the form of the Wild Rose Independence Party. You've got the Maverick Party at the federal level. You've got red Tories and the PCs unhappy once again and flirting with the idea of even maybe just stomaching Notley, and because they don't feel at home in Jason Kenney's party. And then on the other level, you've got people more to the right who feel that Jason Kenney's copped out too many times. So this coalition that he assembled in 2019 is unsustainable. It's just not
No,
sustainable. It's not
impossible.
going to last. It's like what happened to Mulrooney at the end of his grand coalition in the 80s. It just collapsed, and out of it came a separatist party. It's very similar, really, but on the provincial level. Out of it has come multiple separatist parties during his tenure, and it's insane. I genuinely never thought I would see, like, everybody thought it was going to be such an easy ride for him, and he's blown it, due in large part to his own blunders, of course, because he's not as skilled as a Harper or even a Mulrooney at keeping a coalition together. He trips over his own partisanship and gets caught in his own hubris, and he's been exposed for what he is. And I hope to God that they vote him out. I mean, maybe he'll survive somehow because, like you said, maybe, I don't know if he'll try to rig it or what he'll do, but it's just beyond the pale. As that man who was this once strategic genius and cabinet minister, like, just his fall from grace has just been something else to watch. But I think part of the solution for that province or part of the solution for the country, I should say, right now, it seems like there's something that's united us about Ukraine, which is good to see. That's united us in a way that we haven't been united in a while, and it seems like the vast majority of Canadians support that, though of course there are the PPC types and the conspiracy types falling to the Kremlin-backed propaganda. That being said, it seems there is a need from Europe in the immediate future to develop our oil. I don't really love it or agree with it, but nevertheless, today the feds approved the Bay du Nord project in Newfoundland. It's an oil project off the coast of Newfoundland, and I don't really know what it means. I don't know if they'll even get it up and running in time before someone else steps in to give Europe oil. I don't know if it'll serve that purpose. I don't know if this is how badly this is going to harm our efforts to curb our emissions before 2030. We've never once met an emissions target in this country. Everybody seems to think that we're environmental heroes, but we're not, folks. Like, we're sure, we're not as big as China, we're not as big as the States, but we've never once met our emissions targets. Never once. And if the Tories get back in, they'll even get rid of the only carbon reduction plan we have. How's that? And then they'll replace it with something that is meaningless. So that's where we're at. And so I really don't know what this means. This one kind of has me a bit flummoxed as to how to process it. I know I was unhappy with Kinder Morgan. I don't really like this. I don't really like any form of this sort of development. Maybe from a geopolitical perspective, we can be useful and provide some oil to the Europeans, because I know they can't get off. Some of them can't get off oil right away. So maybe we can fill the whole short term. And they claim it'll be carbon neutral by, I believe, 2050 or something. But it's like, I mean, I don't know. I'm skeptical. I tend to be skeptical and cynical about these kinds of things. What do you think?
I can understand why so many people are so furious in Alberta, because our governments are, in a sense, selling a fantasy to them. And I think Notley was correct to point it out. Not politically correct, because I think she is really repeating Jason Kenney's lines, and it's not going to help her politically to be against Trudeau's emissions plan at all. She is firmly in the camp against the oil industry. I don't know why she keeps trying to care so much. I think it's because she actually cares about, she's a little too quaint, a little too caring about the actual economy, when she needs to be much more focused about keeping her political coalition together. And her political coalition couldn't care less about the oil industry. So, if I was her, I'd just shut up about that and focus on NDP social policies, which is how she's going to get back into power. But I can understand why people in Alberta are angry, because I think you don't need to be that intelligent to realize that the current plan as it stands is not possibly going to work. If there is a huge emissions reduction, it's not going to be a just transition. It's going to leave a lot of Albertans out of work, and as you said, there's no UBI, there is no safety net to catch these people.
Until that's implemented.
And and also, like, you have a lot of technological dreams of carbon capture and utilization that's going to take a completely different type of worker, a completely different type of skill to build and implement this sort of technology. It's not like you can go from building pipelines one day to I don't know, mining carbon the next day. You need
certainly
to be
not.
retrained.
But one of the things that has been
for that, and we also have, and Alberta has some of the highest tuition in the country.
But one of the things that's been proposed for that is retraining, though, right? Like, I mean, I know that would be difficult, but you'd certainly be able to retrain some of the workers.
No, like retraining. I think retraining is useful, but in combined. When you have Kenney as well removing tax credits for students, it's also harder to go back to university and actually learn those new skills.
Sure.
So you sort of feel like you're getting it from both ends, essentially, if you're in rural Alberta, because like you're losing the business sector doesn't care about the social conservative values, or it's in a polarized social media environment. The business sector can no longer take the Ernest Manning approach of we'll be socially conservative but be quiet about it. They can't do that because their customers are demanding that companies take a more progressive political tact, and that's perfectly acceptable. I think that's actually been one of the greatest developments of the past. You have like CEO Tim Cook, who's willing to stand out. I'm gay, and I'm willing to defend our gay Apple workers, and like rather than forcing them to hide their identities. It's a really good development of the business community that they're willing to take more progressive stances.
Yeah,
and so like the business community is sort of moving more and more towards the NDP camp. So you see yourself being you're being made politically and economically redundant at the same time. So what is the plan to fix it? I do think it takes it. I do think it's going to take a culture shock. Like we do need Alberta's economy absolutely can be revitalized, but it needs new people to come in. It's like if this technological transition is going to occur, if new jobs are going to come, we need new people to come. And right now, the culture is preventing new people from coming here. So a family friend of ours, he's an Indian. I think he was a pharmacist in a relatively small town where he used to grow up, and he told us, he had to leave to Red Deer, to a bigger city, because in the small town he was constantly getting people would yell at him. People would scream at him on the city just because he was Indian. They would like make racist jokes at him all the time. Just constant racism. And I definitely had many conversations with otherwise lovely people who would talk to me about how the dangers of Islam, and also whatever you want to say. Like the guy will be smiling and it'll be the most beautiful conversation one night or 1 second, and then it's the most vile xenophobic thing you've heard in the next sentence. That's just what you get when you run a provincial campaign and you're knocking on doors. Like I knocked on many thousands of doors during the 2015 campaign, and I met a lot of nut jobs. The reason why there are not new people moving to rural Alberta is because they're afraid to move there. It's a cultural shift, but it's a cultural shift that can occur if we are willing to force it. And I think that's really is the only the culture and the economy are strictly merged at this point. If there's going to be a just transition, if there are going to be new jobs, we need an influx of people. That's the only growth that we have in our economy. That's Canada's superpower. As I said, we can attract new people. We can attract new talent. We can attract new brains. We need to bring them there. And if people are afraid to go to rural Alberta, if they're afraid to go to rural Alberta, then the jobs aren't coming back. It's just going to be an area of permanent decline and stagnation.
But Jacob, here's the question.
The culture is just going to get worse because of that.
But so here's the question then. So, like, it could, on the one hand, and there's a high chance that this is the truth, Alberta could be screwed. Rather short term, if not short term, then perhaps long term. However, is it possible? So there's a lot of hypotheticals happening after the other. But as you said, the business world is probably going to go NDP. That's seeming less and less like a hypothetical. That's seeming like something that'll eventually become true. We don't know yet, but
well, the
it's
NDP
looking
was
like
willing
it will.
to work with them on they had a government panel to reimpose like their carbon tax as well as their curriculum. Like business was willing to work with Notley's government. Absolutely.
Right, but so let's say that happens. So business works for them. Let's say that happens. Business works for them. They start churning out partnerships, more and more partnerships with the business community. They had, as I recall, they had some good partnerships with even the oil and gas community the oil and gas community was so pleasantly surprised about how Rachel Notley worked with them by and large. So that's already in her pocket. Let's say that she works up the courage to introduce something like basic income. There's big news the other day when PEI Premier Dennis King signed a letter with the official opposition Green Party and the Rump Liberal Party to ask the feds to help them implement basic income in PEI because they thought it would be, as a small province, they thought it would be a good training ground for the rest of the country. Let's say that goes well, let's say that gets implemented, goes well. Rachel Notley works up the political courage to try something like that, begins to transition slowly away from oil and gas over the next few years, or starts to set up the transition, puts in place a retraining program. There's already basic income. Now, let's say she gets a little bit bolder and maybe negotiates with the feds to bring in something like, so there was an Atlantic immigration pilot. I don't know if it's still going on, but settling new immigrants in rural Nova Scotian communities, which up until recently were dying out. Now, believe it or not, and I only really learned this when I came back here recently, and like when I moved here, towns rather like Tatamagouche that even 10 years ago were ghost towns, just outside where my cottage used to be, are completely rejuvenated, and in large part it's due to new immigration, and that generates new economic activity. And so that's been quite something to see. One of Nova Scotia's most beloved chocolatiers is a Syrian refugee. So let's say something like that gets implemented in Alberta. They bring economic activity back to rural areas. Rural areas get cultural exposure. There's a basic income in place to guide them in their transition away from the oil sector. Alberta's finally diversifying its economy. It's late to the game, but it's finally diversifying that economy. Maybe the oil guys become green tech guys. Who the hell knows, right? Maybe former oil fields, you'd have to probably fix the ground in and around there, but maybe some areas of former oil fields could be developed for something else at some point and generate more economic activity. The reality is I think people feel boxed in about Alberta, and like I said, you know way more about the Alberta situation on the ground than I do, but just as a Canadian looking in and who's casually followed some of it, it feels like the sky could be the limit for Alberta. I don't know if culturally if they'll be able to pull out of this tailspin, because they really need some good news stories. But the sad part is there's a whole sect of the population that's very angry, that's armed, and thinks that either Jason Kenney or somebody to the right of him is the one to help them. But they're just driving them further and further down the rabbit hole. And the NDP could be the ones, I'm sorry listeners from Alberta, could be the ones to pull you out of that tailspin. We'll have to see like how a number of things happen on the national level. Like I said, the hypothetical does get implemented in PEI and goes well. And Rachel Notley for sure getting elected, which I think is very likely given Kenney's approval rating. But a lot of these ideas aren't so far fetched. Now other countries have already started transitioning. We can learn from them, including their mistakes. Maybe give your last word on this, and then we'll wrap up. And
I think that if this, like, everything that you've said, your vision is perfectly acceptable. I think that's the absolute ideal, and I would love to see that happen. But in order for it to happen, I think you need a much more rigid, a much more even authoritarian implementation of this cultural change. And I would liken it a little bit to the Reconstruction era in the American South, where just as the Union in the American Civil War destroyed and economically devastated the American South through their war, as well as emancipating all the slaves, they had to. The federal government basically occupied and controlled the southern United States for a good portion after the Civil War. They helped them rebuild their economy, but they also took a very tight control over the political conversation in those states. And they prevented a lot of reactionary forces from coming to the floor. Like, they made it very clear that you are not going to express separatist ideas in their political discourse. You're not going to express racist views in your political discourse. And then, of course, as soon as the Reconstruction era ended, as soon as the federal government stopped paying such a direct attention in this American South, well, Jim Crow started, and all the violence and against black people began, and all these, like, there were black congressmen, there were black representatives, there were black communities that were growing up in the United States. Those are all essentially destroyed. I think that we can sort of use that example for the correct way to rebuild an economically devastated area that does have extreme right-wing tendencies. You need to have a very firm hand. You can be, and it needs to be beneficent, of course. Like a UBI, great idea. Lots of spending. You need to be generous. But if you're willing to be generous, you have to show the carrot and you have to show the stick. You have to be able to tell people what is the realm of acceptable views. If the culture shift is going to stick, you need to have some sort of policy where you are stopping the most extreme elements from expressing their views, from imposing their views, and from organizing in more extremist camps. The government went a good first step in declaring a national emergency and going after the trucker convoy. I was personally worried they were never going to do it and they would just let them sit around. Now we just need to take the second step and I think go after separatists. We need to send a signal that this sort of anti-multicultural, xenophobic, separatist language is unacceptable, to pave a way for this shift to happen. And I know no one likes top-down approaches. I know that no one likes it. But if we're going to rebuild effectively, it has to be done. And we can turn this into a paradise, but it's going to take carrots and sticks, not just carrots. Because then we're just feeding a racist horse.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Chairman Jacob just wants to spoon-feed you your vegetables. And, no, you know, as usual with us, the merit of what you're trying to do, I agree with. I think I would go about it differently. I've expressed how I would go about it differently. But we could go on a feedback loop, I'm sure, about this, but I'm sure you've heard enough of our voices, viewers, so we will leave it there. Now
it's time for the feedback loop to be done in the public discussion.
Yes. So please, I want to hear your takes on this. If this got you angry, if it got you inspired, if it stirred your interest at all, if it didn't, send us your feedback at speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. That's speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. And we will see you in the next one.